Hello everyone and welcome back. So in today's video, we are going to talk about use context, which is part of our React Hook series. In this video, we will cover what use context is, how to implement use context, and then how use context can be used to optimize our code. So for this and more, let's dive into it. Alright, so before we even dive or talk about use context, let's first understand the general idea about what React context is. Okay, so on my screen I have a structure here which shows a structure of components, right? So the parent component is the app component, and beneath it are the children components. Okay, so in React context, when we say React context, what we basically mean is a way of managing our state globally. Okay, so from our previous video, I made you understand that states are basically data that are stored in a component. Okay, so in this diagram, you have the app component, which is the parent component, and it has user ID stored as a state. Okay, now when component G wants to have access to this user ID, what happens is the parent component passes this ID or this state to component A. Now component A passes it on to component B, then from B to E, from E to G, right? So it's a kind of like a drilling. So we pass the state or the data from one component onto the other until it gets to the final destination. Now let's look at the current implementation for that. So in my VS Code, which is my code editor, I've done the implementation, and I'm going to take a second to take you through that. Okay. So at the top here, we are just importing our use states. Of course, that is what we are going to be using to store our state, right? And then we have our parent component, which is the app component right here. Inside our state, we are storing Christian as the default value for our user. And then we have this, which is the set user function, or the function to update our user. Inside our app component, we are calling a children or a child component right here, which is the component A. We are passing in user component or user data inside the component A. Now when we come to component A, we get the data right here, and then we pass it to component B. Same implies here. We get the data, pass it on to component E. Now component E gets it, pass it on to component G. And finally component G gets the data right here, and then use the data. Okay, so here we are trying to just give a text which says hello user again, right? So clearly, as I showed you in the diagram, we get a state or the data from here, and then we pass it onto the rest of the component until it gets to the final destination. Now let's look at it from the web application view. Okay, so this is currently what is happening. The main component or the parent component, which is the app component, is the one with the yellow background. Component A is red, B is blue, E orange, and then the last one is G, right? So the user data is being defined at the top level, which is the app component. Now clearly you could see that components A, B, and E didn't use the data, but then we had to pass it through them because we want to get it to component G, right? It's a great implementation, but trust me, it's not really optimized. Okay, what if I tell you there is a way where we could just define the data or the state in the parent component and then still have it or have access to it in all the children components or wherever you want to have access to it? And that is when use context comes in play. With use context, we can actually define it here, and then without passing it through the rest of the component, we can get it in our component G. And we are going to take a second to implement that. Now let's go back to our code. Okay, we are going to clear some of the code. So I'm just going to remove these ones. Okay, so I'm just going to remove these ones. So anything user, okay, component B also don't need it, so I'll just remove it from here. Okay. Okay, so now we are done. Like we say, our code is quite clean. Okay, so now let's start with the implementation. The first thing we have to do is import, uh, create use context. Okay, so create context. Create context is what we are going to use to define our user context. Okay, so I'm just going to say const user context. Oops, right? And then here we are going to say create context. So we are going to create a context, and then we are going to wrap our parent content or our parent content with the user context. Okay, so let's go back to our uh, diagram. With this current implementation, right, all these components are inside or are within the app component, which means when you wrap anything or when you wrap something around this app component, you've actually wrap it around the entire project or entire application, right? So with that understanding, we can just come here, cut this one from there, okay, and then we say user context, okay, dot provider, and then we paste our application or our parent component right here, okay, and then here we are going to provide a value which is user in this case. Okay, now we've made user, which is this data, accessible by or accessible to all the components that are within the app component. Okay, so we'll just go to G where we want to use it. Okay, and then here we are going to say const user. Okay, and then we are going to call another, or we are going to import another function which is use context. Okay, so first we called create context, and then now once we are done creating the context, we have to use it. So we are going to use context. So I'll just come down here and say use context, and then we are supposed to pass in a value. We are supposed to pass in the context that we want to use, and in this case is the user context. Okay, now when we paste this one right here, clearly it's not accessible, right, because it's not global. So you could say there is a message which says user context is not defined, right? So it means you have to um, bring this one to the top level. Okay, so now it's accessible to all the components, right? So now you come back here, and then boom, as you can see, now let's save it and let's go back to our application. Let's refresh it. Okay, now you see everything is working like previously, right? But this time around we are not drilling the user data. Okay, so we get the user data in the app component, which is the parent component. We create a context for it, and then we wrap the entire application with the context provider, right? And then once you go to the component, you can utilize the data, or you can utilize the user data in the component that you want to use it. Okay, and this is all thanks to use context. With use context, we don't have to do drilling anymore, right? Yeah, so that is basically what this video is about, and I hope you really enjoyed it. If you did, kindly click on the subscribe button, like this video, share this video with friends, and see you in the next one. Happy coding.